And no one even talks about why we allowed all of those men to be surrounded and chopped up like they were. And even today, they don't even talk about it. But it was wrong.
Incheon landing and the recapture of Seoul, General MacArthur ordered American and UN soldiers to move rapidly north across the 38th parallel. The goal was to destroy what remained of the North Korean army and reunify the country. But the Chinese had other plans.
One of the great mistakes that General MacArthur made was his failure to recognize that the Chinese had entered the war. Touring around the area on reconnaissance in my Jeep, every village, every person we met was talking about Chinese, Chinese, Chinese. There were Chinese everywhere.
Soon the bitter North Korean winter began to set in. The temperature could drop to 40 degrees below zero, and the troops were not prepared.
I remember on trips up to the front lines, the Marines had the old Mickey Mouse thermal boot, which was an innovation in those days. The Army was still with the old World War II leather boot, so that at night the Army would sneak across the division lines and try and swipe the boots from the Marines.
On November the 3rd of 1950, when we were on the Yalu River in North Korea, we were under the impression that the war was over, and we were waiting to go home. We had no winter clothing at all, because we didn't think we would need it.
MacArthur said to his army in November, "We've won the war, the communists are finished," and left his army out exposed. And then he made the announcement, "We'll be home for Christmas."
Well, in Thanksgiving of 1950, we were located in the Chong-Chong Valley on the Chong-Chong River, about 20 miles north of a little town of Kunuri. And the mess sergeants brought up our Thanksgiving dinner, turkey and the trimmings and the hot food containers.
And there was nothing happening. It was very quiet. It wasn't even a shot fired. And then all of a sudden, a tremendous bugle blowing, horns blowing, and the Chinese crossed the border.
Just before daylight, when the first rosy fingers of dawn were streaking through the eastern horizon, firing began to break out, and we found out that there were Chinese soldiers all around us and among us. They were swarming all over us. And for the next hour until it got daylight, we were engaged in a bitter firefight, hand-to-hand fighting. We had to leave our people behind, who were begging us not to do so. They were wounded in the rice paddies alongside and screaming, "Please don't leave us behind. Don't go off and leave us." But we had no choice.
I'm very happy that I got out. However, a lot of my colleagues did not get out. There was only 10 of us that got out of 250 that was either killed or captured.
And no one even talks about why we allowed all of those men to be surrounded and chopped up like they were. And even today, they don't even talk about it. But it was wrong.
The problems were just beginning. Across the mountains near the frozen Chosin Reservoir, 25,000 men in the U.S. 1st Marine Division were surrounded by Chinese and fighting for their lives.
And about 10:30 at night, flares started flying. Chinese screaming, "Marine, you die, Marine, you die." And they came forward in wave-like tactics. I got hit in the face and chest by fragments of grenades. People saying, "Captain, what do we do?" I said, "You better fight or we're never going to get out of here."
It was the first wave would have hand grenades, the second wave would have rifles, the third wave would have nothing. As the Chinese troops in front would fall, the ones behind would pick up their rifles and continue in.
There was a Tokan Pass that had to be held. If they had taken the hill, they could have cut off the only road, and our men wouldn't have gotten out. I was able to get behind a rock and shield myself, then I was able to pick some of them off. I got hit in the leg on the right side, trying to get the ammo cans to the machine gun that was on the point. And then I got hit the second time in my lower part of my left leg. It's like Custer with the Indians surrounded him.
And the regimental commander sent to me and told me in somewhat desperate terms that we've got to rescue them. It would have been disastrous for that entire part of the operation if we had failed to open that pass.
After the third day, Colonel Ray Davis broke through to help us hold the hill.
By this time, the 200-man plus company was down about 20% on their feet. The place was just strewn with frozen Chinese bodies everywhere.
Here are some of the casualties, which among Americans alone have passed the 40,000 mark, with 6,700 dead and 27,000 wounded. Another 6,100 are missing in action.
And when they carried me off the hill, the doctor had came into me and said, "I got some good news for you." And I figured, what in the hell can good news be after I just had my 2 legs amputated? And he said that the division broke out. And it just turned me completely around from feeling sorry for myself to being happy.
When you're standing there in combat or laying down in a foxhole and your foxhole buddy raises his head and gets hit in the head and half of it blown off, you really then realize just how short our lifespan is and just how fragile we as human beings are.
In January 1951, the Chinese began a major new offensive to drive UN forces off the Korean peninsula.
And they were marching in a column of 4 abreast in at least regimental size, if not more. We had on the road 2 sets of quad 50s. These 50 caliber rounds were smashing into this column of 4s at a horrendous rate of casualty, and they just kept marching. Our soldiers got so traumatized by the killing that many of them stopped firing.
The unexpected entry of 300,000 Red Chinese across the Manchurian border may well precipitate World War III.
If aggression is successful in Korea, we can expect it to spread throughout Asia and Europe and to this hemisphere.
The president has stated that the use of the atomic bomb is being considered to halt the communist onrush inspired by Russia.
I think that it's quite true that the Korean War was a dangerous war in the sense that it might have led to nuclear exchanges. It conceivably could have, because it took place at the very height of Cold War tensions.
Within 3 days, the communists had recaptured the South Korean capital of Seoul. The situation was becoming desperate.
Our Army commander, Walton Walker, was killed in Seoul, and they flew in a new guy. His name was Matthew Ridgway, and a miracle happened. Overnight, the Army went from this defeat attitude to one of, let's go get the Chinamen, let's go north, fix bayonets.
And it was about this time that the Chinese said that Americans, we were afraid of cold steel, that we relied on our air and artillery drew a fighting force, I took exception to that. My forefathers fought in the Civil War and used a bayonet with lethal effect. And I called my troops together and said, we're going to start using the bayonet. It's a stupid thing to go charging against enemy machine guns, you know. When you do that, a lot of times the enemy sees those bayonets coming, you're screaming like mad and so forth. They're scared and they run. And in the first couple of attacks I made, that's exactly what happened.
2 months later, UN forces had once again liberated Seoul, but fierce fighting continued around the 38th parallel, right where the war had begun. The plan to reunite Korea was abandoned.
I think it was in April of 1951, and then the Chinese hit us, and they hit us for about a month straight, and they really had their stuff together. The Chinese hit my platoon first, and all I could see was, in the beginning, was a forest moving towards me. And the forest was Chinamen holding little trees. We started cutting them down and bringing in artillery. We were able to drive off the enemy, but not until that there were stacks of enemy in front of my platoon, 3 to 4 feet high.
When we were stopped at what is approximately the 38th parallel, the demilitarized zone now, we weren't stopped because the Chinese stopped us. We were stopped because the politicians stopped us.
As the bloodshed continued, President Truman began to seek a diplomatic way to stop the fighting.
I believe that we must try to limit the war to Korea for these vital reasons: to make sure that the precious lives of our fighting men are not wasted, to see that the security of our country and the free world is not needlessly jeopardized, and to prevent a third world war.
But General MacArthur disagreed with the president, defiantly insisting that there was no substitute for victory.
MacArthur made it known that he wanted to go to all-out war against China. To have expanded the Korean War as MacArthur wanted by even using the atomic bomb against China would have been a mistake of biblical proportions.
The tense situation exploded in April of 1951. MacArthur publicly criticized U.S. policy in Korea and was relieved of his command.
I now close my military career and just fade away.
The war raged on for 2 more bloody years. With the war in a hopeless stalemate, peace talks began late in 1951. Throughout the protracted negotiations, United Nations and communist forces faced each other from dugout bunkers, much like the trenches of World War I.
Once it got settled down, the lines were established, no one wanted to upset that and really go out and win the war.
Well, it's frustrating being a leader and knowing that in every one of your soldiers' heads, they're always playing this message: I don't want to be the last son of a bitch to go down in this war. So it took a special breed of soldier to go out and go on patrol. Here these guys could tomorrow cut a deal and you were killed the night before.
The soldiers didn't know exactly what they were fighting for. They were telling us that we were here to stop communism. We get up in the morning, we jump on a tank or an armored vehicle and go all the way up there first till you encounter the enemy. And then you would shoot. You have a little war going on. And at the end of the day, you get back on the tank and come on back. And then the next day, you do the same thing. The thing that bothered me a lot of times in Korea was when I saw little orphans, little children, crying. We went into this house, and we're looking for people. We're going to shoot and everything. And I kicked this door in, and I'm ready to shoot who's ever in there. And there's this old man laying in bed, just gray. He's dead, but there's a little young kid crying right there. Maybe maybe I'm 4 or 5 years old. I still remember.
They would fly over our position, and knowing that we were African-American troops, and they would say to us, why do you want to fight us? What have we done to you? When you go back home, you can't go in a restaurant, you can't get in the front of the bus, you got to get in the back of the bus. We're going to drop these pamphlets, and you pick these pamphlets up, and you cross the line, and we will treat you differently.
You know, after a while, you got to thinking, why is all this? And nothing was happening. It was just back and forth, back and forth.
More and more, the war turned into a series of battles for barren hills where lives were exchanged for real estate.
We had a terrible fight on a hill called 400, and I had 8 men killed. And they were my brothers, and so it was a terribly emotional experience for me. I can remember hugging one guy that was dead, and it got to me, you know. And I remember the doc, Jimmy Mayamura. They couldn't get a vein. He was badly hit.
And so people gradually, after the casualties started mounting, people gradually came to turn pretty much against our involvement in the war out there. Maybe it's the first time we'd had that kind of thing. That came much more to the fore later on in Vietnam, of course.
Many a mother was saying, why, oh, why is my son over there dying in a faraway land for a people we've never seen in a country we've never heard of? But of course, freedom is not free, so the war had to be fought.
There was a friend of mine who went to the Korean War, and he was playing bass with me at the time. And I'd only written one or maybe one protest song, and that was it. And it was about him having to go to war.
This is the battleground. Where Jimmy learned to kill. Now Jimmy has a trade, and Jimmy knows it well, too well.
When you look back on it, the jet aircraft came of age in the Korean War. Fortunately, the Air Force had F-86s. That was the only airplane that could really go head-to-head with MiGs.
In one aspect of the war, the air campaign, U.S. and UN forces were dominant. Marine pilots and naval aviators flew dangerous ground support missions to help those on the ground battle overwhelming forces.
Most of my original missions were on close air support work in front of the troops, or going up country beyond the lines and hitting bridges and roads and communications centers and things, and troop concentrations, things like that.
Oh, it was muddy and it was lousy looking weather. And all I just keep saying, God, why the hell am I here? But the experience that I had in Korea, I wouldn't trade ever. I met the greatest bunch of men that I have ever met in my life. And one was John Glenn.
Probably half the missions that Ted flew in Korea, he flew as my wingman. And he was very, very good.
I made a little bit of a boo-boo that could have been, oh boy, could it have been bad.
Ted got hit and had fire coming out from around the engine, and usually blew the tail off. The whole thing would blow.
But in this particular case, there was no fire in the cockpit, and I dreaded to think I was going to have to bail out of a plane, and I really probably should have bailed out. But anyway, belly landed, got on the mat, no wheels, but boy, I was screeching to a stop.
That was a very close call. That's about as close as you can come and still make it.
I didn't get hurt, but it was pretty hairy, I'll tell you that.
Further north, near the Chinese border, in a zone called Mig Alley, U.S. Air Force pilots waged intense air-to-air combat with North Korean, Chinese, and Soviet pilots.
The Russians trained and ran the war and had actually over 900 aircraft involved in that war. It was not uncommon to see 1,000 MiGs in the air at one time. The Chinese and North Koreans were notoriously bad pilots and no match for us, but the Russians would give you a good fight and many times beat you.
The North Korean and the Chinese forces were all being launched from bases north of the Yalu River. The MiGs would come down and attempt to get at our fighter bombers, and we would counter those with our patrols along the Yalu River of F-86s to prevent them from coming south.
The guns we had deployed on the F-86 there were 50 calibers. It was not sufficiently powerful to shoot an airplane down unless you got really close and hosed the guy.
We're about 5,000 feet. There is flak going off around, and all of a sudden a high-tailed MiG-15 slid in front of me, and then we started scissoring back and forth, both of us trying to get behind the other. Eventually I was able to get behind him and fire some shots, hoping that pretty soon this engagement would be over. I got enough hits, evidently, so he sort of leveled out and headed toward a ridge of a mountain. I thought he might crash, but then he eased up and then ejected. From a fighter pilot's perspective, your profession is to be involved in combat, and there's a sense of wanting that to be able to continue. It's exciting, it's aggressive, and you feel a little sad that it's over.
It's funny, you know, even today, aviators and pilots don't think they're shooting at another guy, they're shooting at another airplane. It's interesting, isn't it?
The fighting and the peace talks dragged on. There were major disagreements among the parties over how to exchange their prisoners of war.
The communists wanted all of their prisoners of war, over 100,000, returned to them. But the American policy was, no, we're not going to have forced repatriation. If the communist does not want to go back to the communist land, we're not going to force him to do so. And it is to our humanitarian credit that we did not force them to go back. But the price we paid was heavy.
UN and American POWs were forced to remain in the horrifying conditions of prison camps in northern Korea and Manchuria.
They were probably mistreated more than some of us were in Vietnam even. And they put them in holes. They covered them up with mud up to their necks. They kept them in small rooms. It was thought control is what it was.
In our camp, in Camp 5, the rate of dying was horrendous. We had to get our boots cut off because we didn't, because the blood and everything we had in our shoes was frozen. I got caught stealing winter sneakers, and I was put in a bank safe, a concrete safe, until I confessed the errors of my ways in stealing from the Chinese people volunteers.
In 1953, some changes took place. Eisenhower had been elected as president, and of course about that time too, Joseph Stalin died. And shortly thereafter, the communists telegraphed that they were willing to sit down and finally reach some sort of a ceasefire, which was finally signed at Panmunjom on July the 27th, 1953.
They made the announcement that the truce had been signed and that we would be going home. Needless to say, everybody was just ecstatic. It was just one of the greatest exhilarating feelings in the world. You know, you're coming home. You're finally coming home.
One of the bright spots in the grim business is the road back to self-respect, dignity, and the feeling of once again belonging to the race of free men after months of a nightmarish existence.
I dreamed of the whole time I was in the prisoner of war camp of vanilla milkshakes. And I said, I want the biggest vanilla milkshake. You can put it over here in a wash tub if you got one. I got sick as a dog, but it was worth the wait.
Not all the soldiers came home from Korea. Today, almost 8,000 Americans are still listed as missing in action.
The first picture